What if Japan invaded the Soviet Union in World War II? It's strange that during the middle of a world war, that two of the great powers would have all of their allies at war with the other great power, but would not have any war. I'm talking about Japan and the Soviet Union in World War II. In World War II, Japan and Russia only barely fought for the last few days of the war, even though they had a massive border. It makes an interesting question. What if Japan invaded the Soviet Union in World War II? What would the borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. The main reason the Japanese and Russians never fought was the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, perhaps one of the most underappreciated battles of history. In 1939, a border dispute between the Soviet puppet state of Mongolia and the Japanese puppet of Manchuria led to a combat between the two powers. In the end, the Russians led by Zhukov crushed the Japanese army and the Japanese pulled back. This had massive, wide-reaching effects. The Japanese military was divided between the army that wanted to finish the war in China and invade the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Navy wanted to invade South and conquer the Pacific. Obviously, in our timeline, the Navy won, but that happened because the Russian victory at Khalkhin Gol showed that the Russians would not be pushovers. In this timeline, the Japanese win at Khalkhin Gol. The war would not be continued, since it was more of a skirmish than an actual war. However, it would mean that the army would win the campaign argument and the Japanese would prepare for an invasion of Russia. I'd just like to say before I start this timeline that part of the reason the Japanese lost at Khalkhin Gol was that the Russians in general had a much better army. Russian tanks and artillery far outmatched the Japanese, and so you could say that to have this timeline start, the Japanese would have to modernize their army, but I honestly think that the Japanese could have won at Khalkhin Gol and pushed a military agenda by simply using more clever tactics. The Japanese, if they decided to invade the Soviet Union, would be in contact with the Germans. I'm shocked at how the Germans and the Japanese had absolutely no coordination in strategy in World War II in our timeline, and this honestly seems like a likelier alternative. Thus, the Japanese would likely invade the Soviet Union at the same time as the Germans, in late June 1941. This was the Japanese plan, to invade from Manchuria and attack Vladivostok, and also strike west towards Irkutsk and Mongolia. If this plan happened in conjecture with the German invasion in the west, Vladivostok and far eastern Siberia would be lost. The Japanese would simply take over part of the Trans-Siberian Railway and thus cut off any supplies to Vladivostok. Even if the Japanese never did seize the Trans-Siberian Railway, Stalin would simply sacrifice Vladivostok in exchange for using those troops to slow down the Germans in the west. The Japanese would also launch an attack west into central Siberia and towards the city of Irkutsk. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, why don't the Russians just destroy the one good road connecting Siberia, thus slowing down the Japanese incredibly? The problem is that Irkutsk is not part of traditional taiga forest Siberia. The city of Irkutsk is part of greater traditional Mongolia. Genghis Khan was born only 100 or 2 miles from Irkutsk, and Irkutsk is basically on the steppe. The Japanese could simply attack Irkutsk through the Mongolian steppe and drive their tank over the plains instead of through the harsh forests. The Mongolians, being Mongolians, wouldn't have enough troops or infrastructure to resist efficiently, and the Japanese would find themselves in Irkutsk as autumn would begin to start. The Japanese would win the following battle. The Russians defending the city would be woefully outnumbered and undersupplied. The best and the most troops would be defending against the German assaults near Moscow. Stalin thought in massive terms, and he knew that he could endlessly sacrifice more and more of Siberia, but that he could not give up Moscow. After the loss of Irkutsk, the Japanese would be forced to spend the next 6 months in camp. I know this is a controversial statement, but winter campaigning does not work in Siberia! This would give the Russians needed breathing space in the west to use against the Germans. The big question of this timeline is whether the Japanese actions in the east would lead to a German conquest of Moscow. The short answer is yes. The force that reinforced the defenders of Moscow in the nick of time came from all over Russia, but it had 18 Siberian divisions in it, which were the bulk of the force. By the point the Battle of Moscow would happen, these Siberian regiments would be practically destroyed. The far eastern troops would be destroyed in the original Vladivostok offensive. The Central Asian and Central Siberian troops would probably still exist, but would be pretty badly mauled in the Battle of Irkutsk and would probably be recovering strength in Krasnoyarsk. The Siberian regiments would not make a decisive influence, and the Germans would barely be able to conquer Moscow. The Soviets would move the capital to Kazan and keep fighting. Stalin's failures would mean that the Communist Party would probably remove him from power. The Russian offensive of that winter would be based off trying to retake Moscow for symbolic value. However, the Russian military at the time was terrible at offensives, and so the assault on Moscow would probably fail. The massive losses in the counterattack against Moscow and the troops deployed would mean that during the Battle of Stalingrad, the Russians would not be able to build up troops needed to reinforce the city. In this timeline, the Germans win at Stalingrad. This would simply drag the war on forever. With the Caucasus oil fields, the Germans could keep fighting indefinitely, but Russia is simply so large that there is no way that they could fully finish it. The war would likely end in the 1950s with a truce and a line drawn from Astrakhan to Estonia. That spring, the Japanese would renew their offensive against Russia. They would strike against the city of Krasnoyarsk, west of Irkutsk. At this point, Japanese supply lines would be so overstretched that they would probably lose the battle. Even if they did not, it would not matter. Siberia is so large that the Russians could just continue to surrender land in exchange for time, and the Japanese would inevitably realize the futility of putting this much time and energy into conquering, well, Siberia, and that their supply lines could not take them much further. The Russians would likely sign a peace treaty with the Japanese, giving them eastern Siberia in exchange for the war ending and freeing up troops for the war against the Germans. The Japanese would, however, use their position in Mongolia, which would become a Japanese client state, and eastern Siberia to invade northern China. The Japanese would launch assaults against Gansu province and Inner Mongolia. This would lead to the conquering of all of central North China. The nationalists, due to the sheer size and population of China, would likely survive in southwestern China and Sichuan. To briefly jump backwards in time, the Japanese would still invade French Indochina after the fall of France in September 1940. This is simply because it was such a good opportunity. The Japanese had waited decades for the European powers to weaken, thus allowing them to create their empire. Having France and the Netherlands collapse under the Germans and allowing the Japanese to conquer their colonial holdings with no fighting would be too good an opportunity to pass up. The Americans would respond the same way, by freezing Japanese assets in America and not selling the Japanese any raw materials, especially oil. Since Japan has no oil, this forced the Japanese to invade Indonesia to get oil. In this timeline, the same thing would happen. The Japanese would also declare war against Britain, since they would be worried that if they did not, the British would use Singapore and Hong Kong as bases to destroy the Japanese Empire in a future war. Pearl Harbor was a massive gamble. The Japanese thought that if they invaded the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia and Southeast Asia, the U.S. would help the colonial powers to defeat them. The Japanese felt that by destroying the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, they could knock the U.S. out of the war, thus letting them conquer their Pacific Empire. The gamble was whether or not the U.S. would intervene in the Pacific War and whether or not it would be good to destroy the U.S. quickly or just hope it doesn't intervene. In this timeline, the Japanese realize that they cannot fight Britain, the United States, China, and Russia all at once. Thus, the Japanese do not do Pearl Harbor and invade the US-controlled Philippines on the hope that the United States will not get involved. In reality, if the Japanese did not attack Pearl Harbor, the US would not get involved. 76% of Americans were for neutrality, and there is no way that the US Congress would accept American boys dying for colonial empires without Pearl Harbor, and without the Japanese declaration of war against the United States, there would be no German declaration of war against the United States, and thus no intervention in Europe. Meanwhile, without American intervention, the Battle of the Atlantic would take a very different turn. The Battle of the Atlantic was the submarine war between Britain and Germany, where the Germans tried to destroy Britain's food supply and raw material supply and starve it into submission. Without U.S. intervention, it is possible that Britain could either starve to death or barely eke out a survival existence. Without American intervention, Britain, realizing that continuing to fight the conflict would be hopeless, would likely sign a treaty with Germany in 1943 or 1944, giving recognition of Vichy France's control of the old French Empire and possibly giving the Germans back their pre-World War I colonies in Africa. Afterwards, Britain would fight an inconclusive war against Japan in which both war-weary nations would smash each other in Southeast Asia. Britain would eventually fall into becoming a U.S. puppet. Ironically, the U.S. would likely prop up the British Empire so that the new countries would not simply be conquered or subverted by the Germans. If Britain starved to death, the Germans would control the British Empire and become a massive world superpower. Canada, Oceania, and the Caribbean would rebel and fall under the US sphere of influence. I've basically made this timeline, and it's called What If the Germans Won World War II, the link to which is in the description. It's the same except for a very different East Asia and Pacific, plus the Cold War between the US and Germany is less certain, since the US would not be a massive superpower with the continued survival of the Japanese Empire. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next timeline. Thank you.